It was a perfect, sunny afternoon, the kind of day that made everything feel light, the warmth of the sun enveloping Marcus, Lisa, and their two kids, Jaden and Ava, as they made their way toward the park entrance. Laughter from other families filled the air, the sounds of joy and freedom creating a sense of peace in the neighborhood. The family smiled, eager to enjoy the day. They had been looking forward to this outing for a while, a chance to relax together and unwind. But just as they reached the entrance, a sharp, stern voice stopped them in their tracks. "Excuse me? Where do you think you're going?" The voice belonged to a woman standing in front of them, arms crossed, her expression cold and hostile. Marcus blinked, confused by the sudden confrontation. He had no idea who this woman was or why she was stopping them. His family had come to this park plenty of times before. Into the park?" Marcus responded, his voice cautious but firm. The woman scoffed, stepping forward aggressively, blocking their way. Her arms remained tightly crossed, her stance one of authority, as if she had the power to stop them. "I don't think so," she said dismissively, her eyes narrowing as she eyed the family. "This park is for residents only." Lisa, ever the calm and level-headed one, raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the woman's attitude. She was starting to understand what was going on. "We are residents," Lisa said, her voice steady, but a trace of disbelief creeping in. But the woman shook her head aggressively, not even considering Lisa's words. "No," she said, her voice dripping with certainty. "I know everyone in this neighborhood, and I've never seen you before." Marcus felt the sting of the unfairness in the woman's tone. It wasn't just the words, there was something about the way she had said them. Something that felt off. Something that was less about rules and more about judgment. The tension in the air was thick, and it was clear to Marcus, Lisa, and their kids that this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. It was a confrontation, and the woman had already made up her mind about them. The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus stood tall, his composure unwavering despite the woman's aggressive stance. He wasn't about to let her behavior slide, but he also knew that escalating the situation wouldn't help. "Ma'am," Marcus began, his voice steady and calm, "we live here, and this park is public." Karen's laughter cut through the air like a sharp blade, filled with mockery. She shook her head, disbelief dancing in her eyes as she eyed the family in front of her. "Oh, please," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You people always try to sneak into nice neighborhoods." The sting of her words hit like a punch, but Marcus didn't let it show. He was used to people like her, the ones who assumed that just because of his appearance, he didn't belong. Still, it didn't make it any easier to swallow. Jaden, their 10-year-old son, gripped Lisa's hand tightly, his small fingers trembling with confusion. His innocent eyes were filled with hurt as he looked up at his mother. "Mommy," Jaden whispered, his voice tinged with sadness. "Why is she being mean?" Lisa's heart clenched at the sight of her son's pain. She looked down at him, her eyes softening. She knew she had to respond in a way that reassured him without sugarcoating the situation. The world wasn't always fair, but that didn't mean they couldn't rise above it. Lisa kneeled to Jaden's level, her voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes, people judge others before knowing them," she explained, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "But don't worry, honey, the truth always comes out." Jaden nodded, though his confusion hadn't fully disappeared. He trusted his mother, but the injustice of the situation was hard to process. Meanwhile, Karen, clearly undeterred by the family's calmness, reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, tapping the screen with a sense of purpose. She began dialing, her voice loud and authoritative. "I'm calling security," Karen declared, her tone smug. "You better leave before you embarrass yourselves." Marcus and Lisa exchanged a knowing glance. They didn't need to say anything. They both understood that confronting her any further wasn't going to change her mind. They'd let her dig her own hole. The more she riled herself up, the more it would be obvious to anyone watching that her behavior was unjust. Lisa smiled slightly, giving Marcus a silent nod. They were in this together, no matter how badly Karen tried to twist the situation. The truth had a way of coming to light, and no amount of calling security would change that. As Karen continued to angrily speak into her phone, her words were drowned out by the steady hum of the park. People were starting to notice the commotion, but no one stepped in to stop Karen. It wasn't that they didn't want to. It was just that people often stayed out of these things. But the family didn't need anyone else to stand up for them. They had already made up their minds to let Karen's ignorance speak for itself. Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving Karen's increasingly agitated face. He wasn't angry, just calm. Calm enough to know that this was one moment in time where he didn't have to raise his voice to make a statement. The way Karen was acting, the way she had already tried to embarrass them, was enough for anyone watching to see who the real problem was. As Karen continued her rant into the phone, she hadn't noticed that the crowd around her had begun to take notice. Some of the other park-goers had stopped to watch, some out of curiosity, others because they recognized the injustice of what was unfolding before them. It wouldn't be long now. Just as Karen continued to rant angrily into her phone, her words full of self-righteous indignation, the sound of a golf cart's engine interrupted her tirade. The cart slowed as it approached the entrance, and a security guard stepped out, his expression immediately becoming one of concern as he saw the scene unfolding before him. "Is there a problem here?" the security guard asked, his eyes scanning the situation. He looked between Karen, who was standing with her arms crossed in a defensive posture, and Marcus, who stood calm but firm with his family beside him. Karen, not missing a beat, quickly pointed at Marcus with a mocking gesture. "Yes!" she exclaimed, her voice dripping with superiority. "These people are trespassing." Her smirk returned, as if she believed this was her final victory. The security guard glanced at Marcus, and then, as if something clicked, his face changed. The stern, neutral expression turned to one of shock, his eyes widening in recognition. The guard stammered, his voice wavering slightly. "Mr. Anderson?" Karen froze, her eyes narrowing in confusion as she looked at the guard, who now seemed to be shifting uncomfortably. "Wait," Karen said, her voice faltering for the first time. "What? You know him?" The security guard cleared his throat, trying to regain some composure. He didn't want to make the situation worse, but the truth was undeniable. The moment of realization was dawning, and there was no turning back. "Ma'am," the guard said, his voice now steady but with a note of respect, "this is Marcus Anderson, the owner of this park." Karen's jaw dropped, her mouth hanging open as the words hit her like a tidal wave. Her face drained of all color as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. The man she had just tried to humiliate, had tried to remove from what she thought was her space, was, in fact, the owner of the entire park. For a moment, the world seemed to stop moving. The air around them grew still, and all that could be heard was the faint sound of Karen's breath quickening as she tried to process what had just been revealed. The crowd around them, which had been quietly watching in confusion, now began to murmur. The realization spread like wildfire. The woman who had tried to exert control over Marcus and his family wasn't just wrong. She had just humiliated herself in front of everyone. She had been so certain of her power, but now she was the one exposed for all to see. Marcus stood there, calm as ever, a slight smile on his face. He wasn't interested in making Karen suffer. The truth was already enough. "Is there anything else you'd like to say, Karen?" Marcus asked, his voice smooth, but there was an undeniable edge to it. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was utterly speechless, caught in the web of her own racism and ignorance. She had assumed her power over the situation, and now, in a single moment, that power had crumbled, leaving her standing vulnerable and exposed. The security guard glanced at Marcus again, then at Karen, who was now visibly shaking. He didn't need to say anything more. The damage had already been done, and the balance of power had completely shifted. Marcus nodded toward the gate, his voice polite but firm. "I think it's time for us to enjoy the park," he said, the words leaving no room for dispute. Karen stood motionless for a few more seconds, unable to respond. Her face was still pale, and the anger she had felt just moments before had been replaced by humiliation. The tension in the air was thick with uncomfortable silence. She had been defeated, not just by Marcus, but by her own prejudice and assumptions. As Marcus and his family walked past her, making their way into the park, Karen's gaze followed them. There was nothing more she could do. The truth had been revealed, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. The crowd, once silent and hesitant, now began to murmur, some quietly nodding in approval, others watching with stunned expressions. It was clear. The power had shifted, and Karen had just learned a hard lesson in humility. The moment was quiet, but in the distance, the sound of laughter from Marcus's family filled the air, a reminder that no one could take away their dignity. They had faced injustice, but they had emerged stronger, their family united, and their place in the park secured. As they continued their walk, the sun above them seemed a little brighter, and the day felt just a little more peaceful. Karen stood frozen, her face a deep shade of crimson as the shock of Marcus's revelation settled in. She stammered, trying to find some way to backpedal, but the words wouldn't come. That's impossible, Karen's voice faltered, her disbelief written all over her face. Marcus stepped forward, his expression calm and collected. His posture was confident, and there was an undeniable sense of authority in the way he held himself. With a slow, deliberate motion, he crossed his arms, his gaze locking onto Karen's. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice steady and clear, "my family owns this entire park. We funded it and donated it to the community." The words hit like a thunderclap. The crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation now looked around, stunned by the revelation. Marcus stood tall, his family at his side, their dignity unshaken in the face of Karen's ignorant and hostile behavior. They were the ones who had made this park possible, not her, not anyone else. Karen's eyes darted around, looking for some sort of support, hoping someone would back her up. But instead of finding sympathy, all she found was the glaring reality of her mistake. The gathered crowd, many of them quietly watching the scene unfold, began to pull out their phones, recording the moment for all to see. A few whispered to each other, their murmurs growing louder as the truth spread. Karen's face turned even redder, her arrogance faltering in the face of overwhelming evidence. Lisa, standing beside Marcus, smirked, a hint of satisfaction in her expression. She stepped forward and, with a slight tilt of her head, spoke up. "Would you like to see our names on the dedication plaque?" Lisa asked, her tone dripping with subtle triumph. Karen's breath hitched, and for the first time, she seemed to grasp the full weight of her error. She had no words to argue, no defense against the truth. She had made a fool of herself, and the public spectacle of her behavior only made it worse. "No," Karen muttered, her voice shaking. "That won't be necessary." But it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no escape from the reality that she had misjudged the situation in the worst way possible. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and she seemed to shrink in on herself, realizing just how badly she had overstepped. The security guard, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up, his tone firm. "Ma'am," the guard said, stepping forward and addressing Karen directly, "I think you should leave." Karen panicked, her composure completely shattering. She stepped back, hands flailing as if trying to salvage something from the wreckage of her actions. "Wait!" she cried out, her voice laced with desperation. "No, I didn't mean—" But Marcus, calm as ever, nodded toward the security guard, making it clear that he wanted the situation handled. "Escort her out," Marcus said firmly, his gaze unwavering. My kids don't need to see this kind of behavior. The security guard moved without hesitation, stepping toward Karen. She had no choice but to take a step back as the reality of the situation set in. There was no escape from the consequences of her actions. The power had shifted completely, and she was no longer in control. The crowd, once quiet and tense, began to murmur in agreement, their whispers growing louder as they watched Karen being escorted out. Some even clapped in approval, the satisfaction of justice being served filling the air. Karen, her face still red with humiliation, stumbled backward, trying to find some way to salvage her dignity. But the truth was clear for everyone to see. She had tried to wield power over Marcus and his family, and in the end, it was her own prejudice that had led to her downfall. As the security guard guided her out of the park, the crowd watched, some shaking their heads, others nodding in approval. There was no more doubt, no more question. Karen had lost, and she had lost badly. Meanwhile, Marcus, Lisa, and their kids stood tall, their heads held high. They had weathered the storm of Karen's racism and emerged victorious, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had witnessed the unjust treatment they had faced. The park, after all, was their space, a place of peace and community. And no one, especially not someone like Karen, would take that from them. As the scene concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus turned back to his family, his face softening with pride. They had stood up for themselves, and in the end, justice had prevailed. "Let's enjoy the rest of the day," Marcus said, a small smile forming on his lips. The power shift had been complete, and he and his family were ready to make the most of it. The day continued, the sun shining brightly overhead, and Marcus, Lisa, and their kids walked into the park, no longer just visitors, but rightful owners of the space they had worked hard to build for their community. Karen's protests were ignored as she was escorted out of the park, her earlier bravado completely deflated. She stumbled, attempting to argue, but no one was listening anymore. The security guard firmly led her toward the exit, and her attempts to salvage any shred of dignity fell flat. The audience, who had been silent and tense just moments before, now broke into applause. The cheers and murmurs of approval filled the air, and Karen was left to exit the park in utter humiliation. Marcus and Lisa, now walking into the park with their kids by their side, shared a quiet smile. They had faced Karen's unjust accusations with dignity, and now, the satisfaction of seeing justice served was palpable in the air. The crowd, once uncertain and silent, now stood with them, acknowledging the victory that had unfolded. Lisa turned to Marcus, a playful glint in her eyes. "Well, that was entertaining," she said, her voice filled with the light-hearted satisfaction of the moment. Marcus chuckled, the weight of the situation finally lifting from his shoulders. "Another day, another Karen learning her lesson," he replied, his tone amused, but also a little bit relieved. They walked a few steps further, watching their kids, Jaden and Ava, running ahead and laughing, their voices full of joy. The sound of their carefree play was a perfect contrast to the tense exchange that had just unfolded. It was a moment of pure innocence, untouched by the conflict that had briefly interrupted their day. As the camera followed them, the scene zoomed in on a sign at the entrance to the park, a sign that had been there the entire time, but had been invisible to Karen and everyone else involved in the altercation. The sign read, "Welcome to Anderson Family Park." The words were clear and unmistakable, a final reminder that Marcus and his family weren't just visitors to the park. They were the rightful owners, the ones who had built this space for the community. It was a place of inclusion, of justice, and now it was a place where Karen's prejudice had no place to thrive. The camera pulled back, capturing the Anderson family as they walked further into the park, their laughter echoing, their sense of belonging undeniable. Jaden and Ava continued to play, their happiness untainted, while Marcus and Lisa shared a quiet moment of pride. They had stood up for what was right, and they had won. Justice had been served, and the sense of fulfillment in the air was undeniable. The day had started as a simple family outing but had turned into a victory for equality, respect, and community. And as the camera lingered on the Anderson family park sign one last time, it was clear that this was a victory not just for Marcus and his family, but for everyone who believed in doing the right thing, even when faced with adversity.